Political ideologies like liberalism, socialism, fascism, conservatism aren't just different answers to the same set of questions, they're different questions. These belief systems often care about quite different things, and many times you'll find that there's an issue or set of issues that is all consuming and existential for members of one tribe that other tribes actually just kind of don't really think about at all. So back in the day when mainline conservatism had a more libertarianish bent, they used to continually fret about the size of the state, how much of the GDP was by the government versus how much was in the private sector. And that just isn't a question liberals really worry about at all. We don't have like an ideal, the government must have 40% or must have 50% control of the economy. Maybe some socialists do, but I think most liberals were just pretty case by case. So it's not just that we have different positions or even different values. It's the relative salience of particular issues, particular values. One really clear example of this in modern politics is the birth rates debate. This is something that is a pathological concern of the modern right. They view this as an existential problem, and it's just not something we on the left, progressives sort of generally, really talk about that much at all. And when we do, it's kind of just to either to rebut a point from the right, or when we're sort of showing intellectual curiosity about the intellectuals of the new right. So someone like Ezra Klein, who has a lot of purported right-wing intellectuals on his podcast and shows a lot of interest in the ideas, he's covered the birth rate debate quite a lot as a way of sort of engaging with, trying to understand the modern right, which I'm honestly pretty skeptical of the advisability of that intellectual venture, but that's another story. Um, and I think most of the rest of us, it's just not something we think about a lot. And I'm going to go out on a bit of a limb and argue that perhaps that might be a mistake. And perhaps it is, and I'm being a bit tentative on this one, but perhaps this is a useful frame and way of looking at society for progressives. Now, I am not, I want to be clear about this at the outset, going to do an Ezra Klein and argue that actually the right has a point about this that's worth thinking seriously about. They do not. Their entire concern about it is inseparable from their misogyny and their racism. But nonetheless, this might be something that's worth thinking about in a more sustained way from a liberal perspective. And I think the best way to argue that is to kind of just walk through my own thoughts. But before I get to that, if you're wondering what is the birth rate debate, let's cover that. And if you're thinking, this sounds a bit creepy and potentially sexist, you would not be wrong. This is an area on which the liberal analogue of modern fascist movements to The Handmaid's Tale is just really not that far out at all. So one basic fact about the world, and this is definitely true, is that the number of children people are having in most developed countries is falling quite significantly. Has been for a bit, and it's pretty undeniable now. So at a sort of base level, for a society, not factoring in people leaving or people coming in, for a society to stay at the same population, you would want an average of 2 births per woman per woman across her lifetime, right? That in most developed countries is now more like 1.6, and in some it's even lower. But it's happening everywhere, and it tends to happen um, as societies develop and become more prosperous. Now, this is something that the modern right is in a way that I think we don't really sort of factor in, is absolutely one of their core concerns. Um, they see it as a sort of moral and spiritual failing that we're not reproducing ourselves, essentially. It's very much grounded, it's very much linked to their critiques of feminism, their increasing hostility to women in the workplace, which is something I've written about, an increasing view that sort of women, I guess, are no longer fulfilling their sort of quote unquote natural function of having and raising children while the men provide. It's also very, very much a racist concern. And the reason for that, and someone like Elon Musk is very, very explicit about this point, um, is that most developed countries, not all, we're seeing this trend, for instance, in Japan or South Korea, but most developed countries are majority white, whereas developing countries tend to be non-white. And so what that means is, as our birth rates slow, the percentage of the global population that is white is falling. Now, your response, if you're a sort of emotionally normal human being, might be, well, so the fuck what? Like, what do I care if the global percentage of white people is 31% instead of 37%? Like, that affects my life in just no way. Why is that something that I would get worked up about? And, congratulations, you're not a racist, or not a extreme racist, at least. But this is something, Musk posts. I was tracking his tweets for a bit. I would say almost every day about this. He's kind of laid off it a little bit, but I suspect he'll return to it. But they call it white genocide, the idea that there is, in its more extreme form, which I think Musk subscribes to, I would guess, is that there is a sort of conspiracy to breed white people out of existence, is the idea. It's also grounded in fears about immigration, which I'll come to. Um, but my friend Brittany Page, who's a progressive YouTuber who talks about politics, many of her family were white supremacists, and obviously she broke with them over that. Um, and one of the things she's always said is, when people fret about birth rates, they mean white birth rates. And that was, I think, an a reading of that debate that people resisted for a long time, but now you don't. That's not something you're reading in or sort of requiring knowledge of the white supremacist sort of dog whistles. It's just something that they're saying. Like I say, Musk is very, very overtly saying this. Um, so that's sort of where they're coming from. There are there are more valid concerns that they can point to. So I think the main one is that it's changing the age distribution of societies. We have more retirees relative to working people, which does create challenges because there's more people drawing out than paying in. It also means that societies, as life expectancies go up, we now have a much higher percentage of the society needing care for, you know, uh, cancer, dementia, Alzheimer's, these sorts of things, right? So the liberal response is, as I say, usually we just kind of, people have kids or they don't. That's their choice. That's kind of our perspective, right? And when we are asked to think about it, we tend to default to something like this. Well, if people aren't having kids anymore, it's probably because they're economically insecure, the economy's not good, there's a cost of living crisis, people don't feel as if they like have the security or material resources. Kids are expensive. Kids are increasingly expensive. The amount that you're sort of required to spend on your children is increasing. And so, if you our answer has generally been, if you're concerned about birth rates, then we need to do the sort of egalitarian, socially progressive stuff that we've been advocating for anyway. And of course, the right's answer is, well, birth rates, therefore we need to do the Handmaid's Tale shit that we've kind of been advocating for and wanting anyway. And I think basically everyone who studied this seriously, by which I don't mean the sort of far-right freaks, but everyone who's taken a proper data-driven look at it says neither of those answers are right. If you criminalize or restrict abortion, clamp down on contraception, start trying to force women into sort of more quote-unquote traditional roles, we have models of that. So like Hungary is often given, Viktor Orban's Hungary as an example. You take away women's choice, you make their lives worse, it doesn't seem to change the choice people are making to not have kids or to have less children. Conversely, certainly many progressives, liberals, socialists can point to, say, the Scandinavian countries that have much more robust social support systems, much more robust welfare states, paid time off when you have children as a right, schemes set up to, I cover this in my Freedom book actually, to incentivize men to take on more parental responsibilities. All great stuff on its own terms. The Nordic countries' birth rates are like 1.4. Like it doesn't make people want to have more children. It doesn't seem to impact the behavior. So if you think about it, like if you wanted to raise birth rates in developing countries, you've kind of got a carrot and the stick. You can use the stick of being authoritarian and taking away women's bodily autonomy to try and force them to, or you can do the carrot of like trying to make it easier to have children and more financially viable. The basic answer seems to be neither of those changes it. And I think this is one of these ones where Samuel Moyn said something on my podcast that I disagree with Moyne about some stuff, but that I thought was really good and really cuts to the heart. Ultimate causality is really hard in social systems. Like, that's a quote from him. You often are at a loss to explain why you had for breakfast what you did, much less the sort of collective decisions of millions of people. So, like, why this trend is happening is a challenging question. I don't have a brilliant answer to it. I wonder if it's a number of things converging, but I don't have a here's why this is happening. I think what can be said is the stuff that is posited as a solution to it by both the modern right and the modern left is not. It doesn't seem to impact it much. Certainly neither the authoritarian solution or the egalitarian one would anywhere near get birth rates back to replacement levels. So here's my point of view, and I think this is where the debate stalls out and goes wrong, is you kind of end up with this, well, nothing works. And I think that's the wrong place to land. I think if we don't know how to solve it, then the question becomes, well, how do we manage it? And that does seem to me like something that's worth thinking through in a bit more of a systematic way on our side. Because I think we've got a choice, right? Like I say, it just does seem to be the case. The birth rates are falling across developing countries, and they start to fall when countries start developing. We're not sure why that is, and we're not sure what to do about it. But you've essentially got two options, right? You can try and reverse that, or you can say, given that, it seems like birth rates will be below replacement levels for the foreseeable future. For, let's just say, I think it's probably safe to assume the next few generations. What should we be thinking about to live in a society whose age demographics have already changed considerably because of that, and will change further? Like, what does that look like? And my view is obviously the latter. I think we shouldn't be thinking about how do we get birth rates back up again, we should be thinking about how do we live in a world where this is the new norm. And both for practical reasons and moral. For practical reasons, it just does appear that the answers we have on the table, neither of them work. We shouldn't do the authoritarian one even if it did work, but it doesn't. And the liberal one we should do for its own sake. I think there are people who feel like they'd like to have kids, but they don't feel able to. Well, that's a restraint on their sort of positive freedom in a meaningful way. I want a society where people can genuinely decide on their own to have kids or not, and that the economy supports and works with them either way. But my appeal there is to freedom, and that's the moral concern. Is I just don't think, this is one of the biggest decisions that you're going to make in your life, is whether or not to have kids. And I think that should be your decision. I don't think the government should be coming in and with a view to try and get you to make it one way or the other. Certainly not in an authoritarian way, but even in a benevolent way. I think the purpose of making it of paid family leave, for instance, as a policy, the purpose of that is to give people the freedom to make that choice. I don't think the rationale for that policy should be to encourage people to make the choice one way or another. And indeed, that is the rationale for most of the Scandinavian welfare states. They're explicitly not set up to try and encourage people to have children. They're set up to facilitate choice, to ensure that that is a viable option should people want to. And I think that is how we should think about it. We should have these social support systems, but very much so that people can make up their own minds. I think the role of government is to allow, both in a sort of constraint sense and in this wider positive freedom sense of giving people the resources to pursue different paths. The government there should be there to try and create as much freedom as it can, and then try and make the social order that results from those choices work for everyone. So in this case, if people are choosing to either not have children or to have less children, which, I think I'm in my late 30s, I know a lot of sort of couples my age, around my age, who don't have kids. That's very normal. I know a lot of people a bit younger than me who aren't planning on. And then when I think about sort of like professional couples, sort of, I know, or like tangential to me, who do have kids, they very often only have one. And I think both of those, either just not having, being in a long-term relationship but not having children, or only having one, would have been pretty unusual when I was growing up. Certainly when my parents were growing up, that would have been quite unusual. And that's actually just pretty normal now. And like, what's wrong with that? That isn't some sort of like grave moral failing against gender roles, as like the fascists would have it. That's just the choices people are making. So how do we make a society where people are tending to make those choices work for everyone? Or to put it perhaps slightly differently and more optimistically, are there changes we can make that would make society better given the reality of those choices, and that those choices seem to be the sort of new status quo for the foreseeable future? And I think they obviously are. Um, I think while this is the result of free choices, and I don't want to try and force people into different choices, it is the case that the demographics of most developed countries are changing such that they're becoming older, and that has impacts. So, for instance, there are more people drawing pensions relative to working age people. That is a sort of fiscal concern because life expectancy is also going up. We have more resources, both financial and just, you know, labour hours worked devoted to care of diseases like cognitive decline and so on. I think fairly obviously there's a few things that we can do to manage the reality of an older society better than we are currently. The first, I think, obviously, and this is why the right sort of is so wound up about this, is I think we want to accept reasonably high levels of immigration for the medium run. Two reasons. First, immigrants tend to be younger, working age people, and so it just rebalances that a little bit. You get more working age people paying into the taxation system relative to pensioners drawing out of it, either directly in pensions or in terms of like medical care. Immigrants are really, among the many benefits of immigration is that they are very, very, very good for government revenues. Because while you're on most visa routes, you tend to be not eligible or not as eligible to draw on social support, and you're often taxed at higher rates. So immigrants, very, very good for revenues. There's two big objections to that. Let me cover them both really quickly. The first and like more rational one is, well, isn't that just kicking the can down the road? Say we allow, to take the UK case, we've got a population of around 70 million. Say we really boost immigration back up to like 500,000 a year. What happens when all of those people retire, right? And the answer, I would say, is, well, look, in the long run, we're all dead, right? This is what we need to do now to make care and social work viable, to make our sort of current economic situation viable. But two, this model of like immigration being a lifetime decision, that's because we have a system in which it takes 5 years to gain permanent residency, and that's going to go up to 15 years if the government has their way, as opposed to my preferred model, which is freedom of movement. So when we're in the EU, if someone wanted to come and work in France for a few years, they could, and then perhaps they'd go home, perhaps they'd go to somewhere else, or perhaps they'd stay. It would be their decision. And I think if we had a much broader range of freedom of movement deals with other countries, then you would get out of this model of like immigration as like a lifetime settling decision. That can be the case, but it isn't always. I would like us obviously to have freedom of movement again with the EU. Now, that in itself probably wouldn't be enough, because all of the EU countries are also going through this aging of the population. So, yes, I think young people, as a question of freedom, ought to be able to go and work for a few years in Italy or the Czech Republic or whatever if they want to. But it wouldn't solve the structural issue as all just sharing around and sort of trading around the increasingly small number of young people that all these countries have. I think we need freedom of movement with developing countries. Now, this is just like politically off the charts. I cannot imagine any sort of like Labour government, or so even the Democrats, would really hear this out seriously. But like the US should have freedom of movement with Mexico. There is absolutely no reason why not. And like I always say with the British case, we have the Commonwealth. Like there's that sort of historic connection there. What if we had freedom of movement with India? Like apart from racism, why not? And let's just say we did, and you had reasonably high levels of Indians coming to work in the UK, and if British people wanted to, I would consider working in India or something for a year. But if it was a free movement thing, then yes, they might decide to settle and stay long term. But I also imagine it would be really common for working age people to come and work for a few years, work for a decade, access, the higher wages that are available here, but then perhaps retire back in India or go back to India later in life. I mean, this is what I did. I grew up in the UK. Because I'm dual national, went and worked through my 20s and early 30s in America, and then I came back home again. Like, this is a thing people do, So I think if you had a world with large broad freedom of movement deals, particularly between developing and developed countries, like people would go where the need was, like sort of let the labour markets work. I know that's quite a lib way of putting it, but like I think like the problems come in many ways from immigration systems being too restrictive and require people to go through these very long um, visa routes that are very arduous and very expensive and sort of force you to like, okay, now you're here permanently, as opposed to like, I feel like going and working in another country for a bit. So that's that. I think like the problems of immigration systems in many ways could be solved by yet more liberalisation of them. The other concern is culture, in that like, and I'm more, I can imagine people rolling their eyes, and I'm already kind of rolling my eyes saying this, but like, oh, what about British culture? What about the Church of England and chip shops and so on? And like, let me tell you, mate, I used to work for the Church of England. And the people who cry about British culture being lost, there is a lot of heritage in this country. We have a lot of fantastic old buildings and traditions, and the care and the maintenance of that is expensive. Like, do you have any idea how much it costs to preserve a 1,000-year-old listed building so that we can pass that on so that our children and grandchildren can also visit it? This is not a cheap thing. And or to make it accessible, to have people who volunteer to show visitors around it, and like this does not just pay for itself through like the fees that you might charge for entrance. And let me tell you, the people who cry about English culture being lost do not lift a finger to preserve the heritage that they have. This is a cudgel that they use to attack people who look different to them. And actually, while I'm on the Church of England, let me tell you this. It's not just the buildings, there is an intangible cultural heritage there. You go to any English cathedral and they will sing Evensong, which is a sort of beautiful choral service that they do on weeknights and have done for hundreds of years. And that is a part of our culture that is worth preserving. And part of that will depend on having attendance and people wanting to show up and see this. And let me tell you this, if you care, the Church of England's membership has halved over the last decade, and it halved the decade before that. If you care about people participating in these sorts of traditional aspects of English culture, you'd best want as many immigrants as you can, because they're the only people under 60 attending Church of England church services these days. So, like, there's that as an aside. But more broadly, if you care about preserving, the traditions and, like I said, perhaps this intangible cultural heritage, immigrants are nothing to do with that, one way or the other, you know. Like, there's so much to be done with preserving, like I say, the historic buildings of the UK, with preserving these aspects of traditional practices. Um, yes, the people, anyone who works in heritage will say, "Come, please help us." Like we're drowning here. Like, please help us preserve our history. Yes, go do that. Immigrants are not stopping you doing that. Like, I think what would happen is if we went down the path I'm suggesting and had free movement within the Commonwealth or something like that, I think you would see different cultures. Next to the chippy, there might be a halal store or something. And, like, that's fine, to use a word that's kind of gone out of fashion on both the left or the right. We would become more of a multicultural society. But the fact that there would be other cultural practices sitting side by side with traditional English ones does not stop the traditional English ones existing. Like, whether or not we preserve our traditions, our historic institutions, our historic buildings, that is a choice we make, you know? And it's not just, this is one that actually winds me up a bit, it's not just that the people who cry about British culture being lost don't participate in the serious work of preserving that heritage. They're often directly hostile to it whenever it goes against their biases. So when the National Trust, which preserves many of Britain's historic buildings, started including information about how many of our historic homes were funded by the profits of the slave trade, which is completely true. That's part of our history. The nativists were apoplectic with rage about them. They tried to organise a boycott of it for becoming too woke. And like the National Trust is not woke, right? They're just accurately talking about our history. Or like when talk about the Church of England again, when the Church of England teaches, as it has done for hundreds of years, that kindness to refugees is a Christian duty, they get furiously attacked from, preaching from the pulpit, to which a former Archbishop of Canterbury replied, I think rather wonderfully, where else would I preach from? But and let me tell you, the Church of England is not woke, like whatever image you have of woke in your head, but they do, as the name would imply, believe in Christianity, and Christianity is pretty clear on the kindness to refugees thing. But no, they are very, very hostile to traditional British institutions and, cultural practices and to the act of preserving our heritage itself when that goes against their racism. So F off with that. I think that concern, when it's wielded, is largely insincere, but positively thinking about the type of society I want, yeah, it would be a multicultural one. Like, I think, do we try and preserve Evensong? That's a question for us. I think we should, but that's not impacted by if people down the street are attending a service or a ritual from another religion. We can do both. There's no reason those things are in conflict. So that's my answer to that. And I say this as someone who actually is pretty interested in preserving heritage. It's not something I talk about a lot, but I think that is important. But that's nothing to do with immigration. And and when I talk to nativists, just like regular people who are anti-immigrant, it's not even that there is some British culture they're investing in. They want one. They say everyone else has a culture. Why can't we? And it's just such a fucking stupid thing to say. Of course you have a culture. What you want is a richer culture that you feel more invested in which case, like I say, join a club, go to church, like that's on you, buddy, So those are the two objections that you get there. Yeah, I think, both because we can't recruit enough people to do things like work in our health services or provide care for the elderly, but also we just need more working age people. Yeah, I think realistically, the pragmatic, self-interested path for most developed nations is to be okay with higher levels of immigration for the next generation, honestly. And I think ideally to do so on a freedom of movement basis rather than like a sort of visa route basis. Now, what seems to be happening is we sort of tacitly accept that we need more immigration, in order to like care for our parents, but we allow it in a way that's essentially creating people who don't have the same rights and standing within our society. So one of the things the current UK Labour government is doing is it's extending the timeline for you to get indefinite leave to remain from 5 years to, in some cases, 15 or 20 years. So, the big chunk of your working life is now being taken up where you have to continually reapply and pay for permission to be in the country. You're always insecure. You never know if they'll renew it next time. For refugees, actually, they're talking about 30 years. When you can be sent home at any point. And so it seems to me like we're sort of squaring the circle of like needing help from developed nations but also being racist. We're sort of squaring that by creating like a modern servant caste, as far as I can tell, where there will be people who care for our parents when they have dementia who are, non-white and from non-Western countries, but we're not going to treat them well. We're not going to give them the same sort of legal standing and security as we do the white native born. And we're going to pay them very badly, and try and make them as invisible within society as possible. Like, that's an uncharitable read of the direction, a lot of countries are going in, but I don't think a ridiculous one. Um, and I just think that can't be the answer. Like, I think just in the UK at least, America's much more wealthy, so they have a bit more of a buffer there. But in the UK, like, my God, our hospitals, our NHS, our care sector are in absolute crisis right now because of our immigration restrictions. Like, we can just allow our parents and then eventually ourselves, because you will get old, and the chances are, I don't want to be too down on it, but the chances are, you will have cancer in your life, or you will have dementia in your life, or you will have Alzheimer's in your life. This is coming for all of us. Like, we can accept that we are going to die with less comfort and less dignity. That's one option. That doesn't sound very appealing to me. The other option, like I say, is like we allow immigration, but we do it in a way that is unpleasant and demeaning, and we essentially create like a modern servant caste. That seems to be the route I think we will go down eventually. That does not seem like an ethical option to me. Or, or we just fucking get over our racism. Like, that seems the most viable one to me, morally. And I think what we'll have to go with that is a re-evaluation, much more broadly, of the value and importance and the visibility we assign to care work. Because care is going to become a lot more common, And I think ideally, back in the day, the norm was, your dad smoked 20 cigarettes a day and polished off a few bottles of whiskey a week and died of a stroke at 57. So this just wasn't a thing. But with more older people and older people living longer, more of us are going to be taking on caring responsibilities. And I think part of, avoiding the sort of modern servant caste outcome is for these to be responsibilities that don't exist in the shadows, that people are proud of doing, and that we recognise and respect. I wrote an article a while ago called Most Men Don't Want to Be Heroes, and I contrasted the experience of saving someone from drowning and providing care to someone with Alzheimer's. These are those were the two examples I went with because these are both things that I've done. And I was responding to um, an article that argued men need to be heroes and we need to be given opportunities to sort of make sacrifice to the common good that liberalism is denying us, supposedly, by a very silly man called Chris Arnard, who I kind of love, actually, because his articles are so ridiculous. But anyway, and I said, Arnard argues that men need this sort of male-coded heroics. But I said, which gave my life more meaning, which was more impactful for me, which allowed me more to grow or develop as a person? This sort of one-time act of dragging someone out of a freezing sea at night, which I'm very proud I did, but like it hasn't stayed with me in any sustained way. Or, being a carer for a family member. It's obviously the latter, right? And there's a structural need for more of us to take on that role. But you can feel very invisible and very alone. And a lot of carers do feel very alone because, to the extent that this was needed in previous generations, it would be sort of foisted off on one of the women on the family who'd sort of get on with it in quiet. But and I think part of that will be about culture and about the sort of respect and standing. Part of it is structural. I think a question we can ask, and a good question we should be asking, is how can we change the design of our economy such that more people can take on these roles? So one thing that really came out of the COVID pandemic was, people can work from home. This is a thing, not every job, of course, but a far greater range of jobs. that people thought than people thought. You can do this. And people proved willing to make very considerable sacrifices in COVID and change behaviours like this. You can ask people to do this for the greater good. So, because one thing working from home does is, if your parents or one of your parents is, say, has Alzheimer's, chances are they're probably not going to live in like central London where the job opportunities are, right? This is my case. If you work from home, you can live nearby or live with them to provide support, um, and not, you can have that sort of geographic flexibility that allows you to take on caring roles. A lot of the time, I'm thinking of the Alzheimer's case here. You know, a family member can provide that support, and like it's a lot of what you need is to just be in the house with them. Because it's a brilliant idea. Depending on exactly what stage someone's at, it might just not be super safe to leave them by themselves for extended periods. But like, they're actually through most of the day, they can read or watch TV or whatever. You don't need minute to minute support. So if you're working from home, that enables that. Um, so that's like one big structural change. And one of the things that like really bugs me is like there's a lot of aspects. Another one would be disability rights. Disabled people, we've had this solution for the longest time of like, we'll give you like public support, but it'll be a pittance. And disabled people have been saying we can and we want to work. We just need reasonable accommodations to be made. And the social response has been F off. I'm cursing a bit on this one, by the way. And what COVID showed is no, like the types of accommodations that disabled people have been asking for, a lot of employers can provide when they have to. And what did we do when COVID ended? We said, oh, now everyone needs to be back in the office because reasons, right? And I agree, there are advantages to in person work, but I think having a norm where fully working from home is an option is something we can do, just one thing that we can do to make it much easier for all of us to participate in this. I'll give you another one. There is a carers allowance in the UK. It's not very much at all, but to get it, you can't work. Fucking why? Right? And it could scale. Say someone, this was my situation, works 3 days a week remotely, and then, takes on other responsibilities in that other time. Why couldn't there be some sort of social support for people who split their time like that? Why is it a rule that to receive support as a carer, that must be all that you ever do? Which means that anyone who does do that is going to live in poverty, essentially, unless they have, like, some assets somewhere or something. So there's all sorts of, like, very feasible changes that we can make within our economic structures to make it easier and more viable for people to take on caring roles. And like, yeah, I would like to see a society now, like, having people you pay for help is always going to be part of it. I think like sometimes care needs are just too complex for the family to handle, especially like as something like Alzheimer's progresses towards the end. But like, I think as more of us took them on, it would become more respected and valued and visible, and that would change the culture around it. And I think that's a really valid question to be asking, to sort of like look at all of our economic institutions and sort of think, you know, like I say, I don't want caring work to just be sort of outsourced to a modern service cast. I think if it's something we all participate in, that would be a sort of better and more moral society. And I think as we sort of think through and design those structures to make it easier for people to take on caring responsibilities, this is my sort of final point. We would want to do so in a way that's very gender conscious, because I think, we're having a sort of social conversation right now about how housework and childcare tends to, you know, it's changed a bit, but it's still very much the case that in heterosexual marriages, women just put more hours towards that. And, that's something that we've sort of talked about as a norm and something feminists have argued that, would be good to change. And obviously I agree. And I think what's going to happen, unless we sort of really, I think, self-consciously think about it, is as more and more of us have to take on caring responsibilities towards parents and grandparents, I strongly suspect unless there's sort of a self-conscious effort made, what will continue is the historic norm of these disproportionately falling to women. And because that work then becomes perceived as female, it's less recognised and less valued. So I think accompanying all of that would have to be an ongoing conversation about gender. Now, I think in a sense, all of this is stuff you would sort of want to do anyway, but I think it does give you a bit of a different framing and a different perspective. And this is just the sort of nuts and bolts stuff of like what I think a normal centre-left party should be advocating for. Like, I don't know. Give me your feedback. This is like Toby's first thoughts. This is thinking in first draft. But I think it is worth, noticing that people are having less children, and as a result, the demographics of society are changing towards a much older society, and we can probably expect that trend to continue for at least the medium run. How would you respond if a sort of politician sort of noticed that and said, let's think about this in a serious, non-racist way? What do we need to do to ensure that our economy is strong, that our parents and us, when we get older, do have the support in terms of, pension, but also have the support, if and when we have, terminal cancer or cognitive decline, that we can end our lives in comfort and with dignity. How do we ensure that? And the politician sort of says, well, look, I think there's a few things. I think, we need to stop this ridiculous anti-immigrant bashing for all sorts of reasons, but one of which is we should have, for the foreseeable future, freedom of movement deals with a range of countries so that we can keep our sort of working age taxpayer base strong, and that we can fill positions like care work. So we want freedom of movement with the EU, but not just the EU. Let's look at what mutually beneficial deals can be made wherever. We need to think in a much more sustained way about how our economic structures allow all of us to participate in providing care for our family. This is just more and more and more of us are going to have to do this, and we want to make it as easy as possible for people to do it, and we want to make it valued and respected in the same way that saving someone from drowning is. This is a social service that we should be doing everything we can to recognise, and part of that will be making sure that we try and make that recognition, make those incentives work in a gender equitable way. Because I don't know about you, I feel like if Starmer was saying that instead of like whatever it is he's saying now, I'd sort of nod along and be like, yeah, that'll make sense. That tracks. I admit, if he started with the idea of declining birth rates, it would sort of set off my alarm bells a little bit, but that's only because the people who talk about that are fascist freaks. If what followed was sort of a sensible, socially liberal vision of the next few generations, yeah, I think I would be like, yeah, that sort of tracks. And none of that feels like impossible to me. Like, I'm not putting the sort of goods I'm trying to get to on the other side of a socialist revolution. Like, all of that could be done from where we are now with fairly small tweaks. If you just secured freedom of movement deals, like, people would come and they would find their way to where they're needed, you know? Like, this is something that can be done without huge lifting on the part of the state. What's holding us back is and what makes everything I've just said feel so unthinkable is our neuroses, I never know which one that is our various hang-ups about race and gender. And I think we just have to ask, are we really gonna let our hang-ups about those things, are we really going to let our racism mean that we die sooner and with less dignity? Okay, thank you for listening, and as I say, this is Toby's first thoughts on it, so do give me feedback on this one.